because of curiosity. I'm just riddled with anxiety. I'm the lowest level as a matter of fact.
So, hi, Stephen. Could you introduce
Hello.
yourself to everyone? How
I'm
would you
Stephen.
describe yourself?
Yes, I'm Stephen Boydstun, and I'm retired.
How would you see yourself, like, as a thinker? How would you describe yourself?
Oh, addicted to philosophy,
Yeah.
really my whole life. But I studied with philosophy as a minor. Then worked in unskilled labor for a number of years. And then eventually decided to make money and became an engineer, and that worked out. And now that's how I buy all these books. So,
And what area of philosophy is really motivating to you?
theoretical philosophy, especially metaphysics and epistemology, but that also includes philosophy of science, the hard sciences particularly, and philosophy of mathematics and philosophy of logic, together with all that general metaphysics and epistemology. So that ball of wax has been my topic for the last 7 years, pretty exclusively, really.
How did you get from manual labor to then engineering to then being so into philosophy?
Well, I never lost, I had studied, that was after college, just doing work for 7 years in unskilled labor, but I never had lost interest in philosophy, really, but I studied more science and physics really in those days. I was in Chicago and I would get up on Saturday mornings. You could use the library up at Northwestern University. I used to get up on those cold mornings and take the L up there to read their professional journals. But eventually, seriously, I get better for myself financially. And as it turned out, not more time to study philosophy. And you see, physics, of course, you need to be doing professional graduate degrees and that sort of thing. I was from Oklahoma. I went to the University of Oklahoma there, and I studied physics there. Became unemployed, and eventually found that I could get a job at the base level of basically working in a fast food place. And I got enough money saved up, about $84 extra, and put it in my pocket. I got on a train from Oklahoma City to Chicago. You could bring your bicycle for free. I did. And I looked in the newspapers in Chicago, in the want ads in those days, and stayed at the YMCA down Wabash Avenue. And I had only enough money to get back on the train, so I hadn't found a job, but I had one little interview and I was on my way back to the train station at that point, but I got the job a job. They made a job for me of unskilled labor. And so I got to stay in Chicago and enjoy all the culture. Eventually, I called up my lover in Oklahoma and told him I had $2.50 an hour. And so he should quit his job there. And he did, got our stuff up to Chicago. He was interested in interior design. He had a degree in that. He pursued that for a while there, but then no success with that in Chicago. And he took an interest anyway in law. And he went to law school at night. And late 70s, became an attorney.
Mm.
And then I became an engineer, and things worked out.
That's good. And how did philosophy fit into that at that time in your life?
Oh, for me at that time, my study of philosophy was really just working my way through history of philosophy with Frederick Copleston's A History of Philosophy. There were these little books, paperbacks, you could also fit them in a coat pocket. And so I'd sit on the skids looking out over the tracks and the river at lunchtime downtown Chicago and read those little books in history of philosophy. But I think later, a little later, in about when Nozick's book came out, Philosophical Explanations, I picked that up and read it straight through, and that was my real introduction to contemporary philosophy, what the professional contemporary philosophers were really doing, how they thought. And so that opened a door for me there.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Nozick. I've read Anarchy, State, and Utopia, so
Yeah,
I see that
right.
interest in him.
Yeah.
For me though, my only introduction to philosophy at first was Ayn Rand, and now I'm really into it from Aristotle and everything.
Yeah.
And I know you like Ayn Rand. When did you first read her?
Oh, I was in college after freshman year. At that Christmas time, a cousin out on a big farm family out in Western Oklahoma, a cousin gave me paperback copies of Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. And he wrote inside of Atlas Shrugged, he said, did that summer and then the following fall. So I was between first and second year of college. Yeah. Oh, that was, by the way, that was back in 66, 67. So the book had been, Atlas had been out for maybe 10 years at that point. But that was a real eye-opener, and that kind of philosophy was certainly accessible to me as well as apparently to you.
Did that change your view of philosophy at the time?
Oh yeah, big change. Yeah, I was my own initiative, really. I had become a socialist, and I did not believe in private property. I thought property allowed people to be selfish, and in my simple way, I thought, therefore, private property should be abolished. And when I read, I had already become an atheist before reading Rand, but when I read The Fountainhead, then that was a big shift, because then I saw, no, loving yourself is good. There is absolutely nothing wrong. It's absolutely wonderful. And then that was a real change of paradigm that I accepted, the new paradigm, and for many years, and a big revolutionary effect on my thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned your trajectory after school. How do you think reading Ayn Rand or even philosophy in general, it affected that development there?
Oh, I think a lot of the practical things in life, careers, your attitude toward work, productivity, love for science, love for new technology. I think all those things I had already before Rand. So I don't think it affected those things, which I found figure importantly in different employees' attitude toward their work. However, on the reverse direction, studying in physics and in engineering too affected my abilities with the theoretical side, especially metaphysics, that I pursue to this day. I mean, it forms a part of your background picture of the world that certainly is different than a humanities student who hasn't had those exposures as far as I did in those, and actually mathematics, of course, too, with those. But so it's kind of a two-way street.
Mhm. And as far as other philosophers, like what are some other philosophers that have really influenced you besides Rand?
That would be hard.
Well, let's start
Yeah,
with
I
Aristotle.
oh,
Aristotelians.
definitely. Yeah, Plato, Aristotle. I study them a lot. I study them right now,
Yeah.
these days. Um, but my first philosophy teacher was a Thomist. It was introductory philosophy, second semester, freshman year. And his approach was very systematic. He's going to present you the truth, the systematic presentation of the truth, basically. And everything's going to be outlined. He, Aristotelian guy, he's going to pace back and forth across the blackboard there as he talking to you. And he's presenting all these classical, as far as down to Thomas Aquinas anyway, the arguments, well, even to late scholasticism. So you're getting introduced with really a new vision of the world, because although I had a science background, of course, in high school and mathematics, you didn't have any philosophy that showed you how much reason could reach. There was more that could be tackled, more problems that and issues that could be tackled in that very systematic way. And he showed us that. He would lecture, I don't know, first half of the class period. It was an honors class. And then we would just discuss it in the second half. So there was a free part too. But he was educated at University of Cologne before the war, and very old school. I can't remember now how I digressed into that, but I did digress, I believe.
So I understand Thomism is some form of Aristotelianism, but what is it exactly? I've always never really quite understood
well,
what it is.
Yeah, definitely Aristotelian, but they had to adapt it to the Christian teachings that had evolved to that point, in terms of the world was created out of nothing. There were certain doctrines that had become doctrines of the Christianity, and the same thing had happened to the Arabs when they earlier got the rest of Aristotle like that. And I don't know what Copleston, I think, mentioned once that the Christian thinkers, at that time, they had to, once it was exposed and translated, they had to respond to Aristotle and meet this, because in Greek philosophy, because it was such a vast, systematic, rather complete conception of things. And so you needed to either assimilate that, or you can do like Protestants later, like Martin Luther, say, well, we're just going to stay clean away from that stuff. So it's one, and the Roman Catholics took the assimilation route, as did some of the Arab thinkers like Avicenna before them.
Yeah. I remember reading about, I've read some of Summa Theologiae, and it seems like Thomas Aquinas has some pretty good ideas in straight Aristotelian, but a lot of the time he seems to rationalize his Christianity just in terms of, like, if you can't observe it well, it's just something else out of our conception, just something like the divinity of God. And we can't understand that purity.
Mhm. Yes, well, and he has all those traditions behind him, which the theological traditions, and he's going to address, let each one of the different parties weigh in. He's going to present them as to what they said on this issue and what the philosophers said on this issue, that being Aristotle.
Mhm.
And then he's going to give his reasoning and final verdict on what he thinks. But of course, it didn't really stop there, because the next century, you have scads of more additional brilliant thinkers with their day to give a try at these questions.
How do you try to answer philosophical questions? I mean, I know you're not trained exactly in philosophy, but I mean, you're very well read in it, obviously.
Right. Well, the thing with me, and actually this has become, during my lifetime, this has become more and more the case with professional philosophers too, is that you bring everything you know to bear, meaning all of your science, all of your engineering, latest brain science, according to the area of philosophy that you're addressing.
Yeah.
However, there are special things that philosophy does. In philosophy, you get to take a wider view of each of the disciplines, and also try to make a wide view, some of us do anyway, make a wide view that brings them all together under one umbrella, not getting much wider reasoning. And came to know how to do that, make arguments, of course. And there is one thing, in undergraduate, I studied elementary logic. Later on, I studied symbolic logic and on up in logic. But logic, in a way, the students coming in there are, they know it, they recognize it. You know, they show you this is a fallacy, and you say, oh, of course, that's not good reasoning. That doesn't save the truth. But there are also things that you needed to get explicit, and that will help you in your reasoning. And a book, this was after my time in early school, but a book like David Kelly's The Art of Reason, those kinds of things in there can really help one when you're making arguments or you're looking at somebody's argument. So that's kind of the beginning of that special thing. But when I write, I've come in recent years to write positively, in a positive way, my own philosophy, which essentially the basics of that, it took about 5 years, will appear next month in the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies.
Mm-hmm.
That essay is called Existence, We. And in there, setting out a long systematic view of metaphysical picture of the world, and to be followed up by a companion piece in a couple of years. But still, that is the basics. That is what I created, and where there are arguments, they are my creative arguments. But the conceptualizations or the reconceptualizations in it are all along the way bring in, very briefly, history of philosophy, comparisons on a given point with regard to comparison to Rand, comparison to me. So, and of course, my setting out of things there is very clear how it's related to Rand. It's just a generation after Rand.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a kind of analysis thing, but informed of all the problems that have been current in philosophy. By problems, I mean practical, fun things they want to tackle,
Yeah.
and have tried to tackle in recent times and through the centuries.
Yeah. So you were telling me before, when you started getting into engineering and got an engineering job, how do you think, well, in relation to your job, what did philosophy do for you?
Oh, well, I don't know. I would tell you this. There was a professional engineering course you take when you're a senior year in engineering school. The man who taught that was a forensic engineer. He had a PhD in engineering, I believe, but he had a law degree. And he used the fountainhead in his course in forensic engineering, for the course in in professional engineering. And what he did was, he had the first 3 weeks, he said, just read the fountainhead, read the whole fountainhead, write me up a 2-page summary of whatever you like about or interested in about. Just wanted to see if they read it. Well, then in his lectures, every lecture was some thing in the fountainhead. Once in a while, he had to recur to Atlas and tell people a little section of Atlas. But a lot of professional ethics stuff is really there in the fountainhead. And I think in my case, it wasn't so much directive as when I got into it. I already had the character. It was just that when you're engineering, you are responsible. You have to be responsible for reality. There are people sticking to reality. There are people who want to push projects they think in a way that wishing makes it so, wishing makes the speed so, that corners can be cut, especially when there's millions of dollars on the line in the project. And then, and I did urge that with engineers I worked with. I said, you have got to be the conscience. You've got to keep the management in touch with the physical reality out there.
Mhm.
So there's some in that direction. I would say on the ethical side, there is some thing that's certainly consistent with things that Rand dealt with and really dealt with as well in Atlas Shrugged at times too.
Yeah, I relate to that too, because even just on a
That's
professional
one
level,
nice thing.
yeah, like my profession is more into psychology and psychology research, and even there it still applies, just in the sense that reading the Fountainhead, even thinking about ethics and philosophy, is just inspirational in the sense that I can find a purpose to why I'm doing these things, not just going through the motions, but a real purpose to doing these things and a way to conceptualize it all together. And that's what I've gotten out of it, and I could easily apply it to other things, and even just anything in life, just needing to think broad range about all your activities and actions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
And what are some projects you've worked on in engineering that maybe reflect your ethics, especially?
Actually, when I was in engineering school, they had this very neat program called, I believe it was called the Co-op program. And you would, after your beginning engineering courses, you could go into this program. And in the Chicago area, anyway, there's a lot of industry that participate in this program, where the student could go and work for a semester in a company, and the company would pay you, and they were in fact they were training you in a way to work in their company someday, they hoped. And so that was wonderful. The company I went with for that part of training and experience was a locomotive company. That is, they built locomotives outside of in LaGrange, a western suburb of Chicago, southwestern. At that time, General Motors had owned the company, which was called the Electromotive Division of General Motors. But in that plant, it was interesting. It was just fascinating because you were building it from scratch. You know, got copper sheets. You're going to cut those. You're going to do all the treatment with them. You're going to bind them up into a cylinder and make a traction motor.
Mhm.
That traction motor is the electric motor that's going to turn the there's a gear off there, a pinion gear that's going to turn the wheel of the locomotive. Electricity that's turning that electric motor is coming from a generator that's on that you've also built, that is on the locomotive. That electrical generator is being turned. It's being turned by a diesel engine, biodiesel engine, which you've also built from scratch. You put this all together. A favorite of Atlas Shrugged to me is when Dagny, I think she's on the first line of the first run of the John Galt line, I'm not sure, but she goes out of the engine cab and she goes back to the engine room to be alone. I assume she was wearing ear protection because it'd be awful loud. But she goes back there and she said, "This is the kind of mind I worship." Who created this? Well, that's me. That is exactly me. And it's a wonderful thing. There's that kind of glorious thing all around us all the time, and those minds around us all the time making things happen. And I enjoyed working in that plant. It turned out that when I graduated from engineering school, I got some offers from other companies, and I went with the electrical utility in that area of Chicago, Northern Illinois, into the nuclear division, because they did nuclear generation. They had like 12 reactors. And they needed, see, the deal is I had a physics background as well, and they could use somebody like that. So I went to, often worked in a nuclear plant that was under construction, turned out the last one built in America. And it was finishing construction, and I was involved in the pre-op with the guys doing pre-operational testing, and worked there. As far as where I landed in engineering, and of course, that process is marvelous too, of heating the water with nuclear fission and getting the steam up to the generator to turn a turbine to put power on the grid. Just amazing.
This is a huge difference going from trains to nuclear. Like professionally, was it really that different for you?
No. The technical principles that you've learned in engineering school has got your basics, and then each company's they're going to have their own training for you that's specific to them. Nuclear is very bureaucratic and has to proceed with enormous check and triple check on everything, and paperwork that documents everything that's been done and its whole history of what's been done to it, because the financial investment is enormous. And if you have an accident, it could be the end of nuclear power in America, just like that.
Sorry, 1 second.
Stop.
It's my timer was, sorry, my timer went off. I forgot about that.
Oh,
It's okay now. Yeah, you can
Okay.
continue.
Yeah. Well, one thing that was disappointing, having kind of a Rand type mentality that I did in some ways, was that I often came across employees, and sometimes managers, but employees generally, they did not care what we were producing. They did want to make money. That's good, but they had no love for whatever it was, the specific enterprise that was so really thrilling to me. But anyway, that was the difference and kind of a disappointment that I found in some people, not all.
Do you think it affected their performance?
Yeah, maybe. I just don't know enough detail.
Yeah, that would make sense. I mean, it's hard to imagine that it wouldn't, in my opinion. But
Yeah. I had one vice president once come out to where I was in the suburbs in later years of, and we were at a nuclear operations headquarters, and one vice president come out there wanting, he said, something I always loved and remembered later. He said, there's just one job here. We're making electricity. That's your job. Everybody's job description here. We're making electricity. We were on the generating side, not the distribution side. And boy, frankly, if people believed it, that'd have been news to them. See us sitting in this office making graphs or whatever you do, you know. That is one thing about those big industries. You don't, you are just doing one small part of it. It is important and you can see the connection, but it's a little different than when you're working for a small firm or you're maybe making your own little firm, where you're in charge of everything. You make the whole thing happen, you know. Yeah.
How do you find time to study philosophy with all the engineering work that you do?
Oh, that had to be weekends and lunchtime. Yeah, and during those years, but in the 1990s, well, my lover of 22 years had died when we were both 41. He had died in 1990. And so while I was alone during 1990s, I would study philosophy full time. It was a delicious treat when I had vacation. So when I had vacation in the year, then what was delicious about it was you got to study it every day, take a book and absorb it, study it. And by then I had begun the philosophy journal Objectivity. I began that as Jerry was in his last months. And then there I was always writing or helping somebody with their research for writing and contributing to the journal. I remember once going to a summer conference by the what was in the Peacock wing. He'd have been part of that in person in the early 90s, and a summer conference in Williamsburg, Virginia. And really, I could only go to about 3 of the different classes they had, because really during that week, I had a book called The Metaphysics of Quantum Mechanics or something like that, that I needed to be studying in my room because I needed to master that. So it was always grappling, of course, until retirement. And I was lucky enough to live long enough and mind intact enough and have the money to buy any book I wanted. And I work on it every day, every morning, beginning before sunrise.
Even at my age now, I feel like I'm studying philosophy every day. I mean, I'm taking time to study Aristotle in particular, especially about the lately I'm kind of reading on the soul, and it's actually quite dense, as simple as some of his ideas are. It's both dense and simple at the same time.
It's hard. It is pretty hard, I think. It's pretty hard. But fortunately, there's a lot of contemporary scholars too that can help you out if you can get to their works.
Mhm.
commentaries and so forth. Yeah.
So we've mentioned Aristotle, Rand, Nozick. Are there any others you can think of that are
Oh my
special?
God. In terms of contemporary philosophers that were in my
Yeah.
lifetime, I mean, I enjoyed reading Fred Dretske, Jonathan Bennett, of course, all kinds of people who are in history of philosophy, and Kantianism. I study a lot of Kant philosophy as well as a lot of Aristotle. And actually, I've known some of those scholars and read their books, but Michael Friedman in philosophy of science, and particularly integrating from the time of Kant, and he's expert in Kant. And in fact, his first book I read was on general relativity, philosophy of that. And he knows his stuff, he knows his math, and he's, you know, probably retirement age now, but he lives out in Stanford now, and his partner. But there are hundreds of books
Yeah.
in my library. They probably cost an average of $50.
Mhm.
You know, they tend to be first. I've got a brand new book by James Lennox. I guess it's not sitting right here. I might have paid $80 for it or something. But it's a collection that's useful for me, and almost every name of authors of these books, which I tend to get right off the press, are people that I truly admire. The way they can mount an argument that is extended over a whole book, that it's brought together. I've actually bought quite a few people's PhD dissertations too, because really those are a book in a way. They're just have a lot
Yeah.
more footnotes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating as well. I mean, you don't really realize how dense arguments can be until you read a real good philosophical book where they
Yeah.
really need the entire book
Yeah.
to get to their point.
Yeah.
It's that
Yeah.
complexity. I love that too. I mean, even just reading something by Aristotle, like some observation I think are like, you think it's so simple or sometimes even irrelevant because it's so like old fashioned, but what he's getting at, or any good philosopher is getting at, is their overall point, something wider than the particulars. I guess Plato would call it universal, but I don't know a better word to use in it's something universally true or something wide, something about existence itself.
Very general. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, very general. A lot of times the ancient philosophers, of course, there was science of their time, you know, harmonics, astronomy,
Right.
certainly mathematics really well, in geometry, but they are greatly handicapped in tackling what are really, we would think of as scientific questions, kind of intermeshed with their most general philosophic thought. And it's, they are the same mindset as thinkers today, but they just didn't have enough. I mean, we live after Galileo and Newton, and after the electrodynamics of the 19th century. And it is just a mind-boggling difference in knowledge of the world and exploitation of the world around us. Same old world, but the knowledge against which we do our philosophy and do it in is very different than theirs, really. It's just that when it comes to value philosophy, like when it comes to ethics and other questions close to that that have come up. There, yeah, you're dealing a lot with the same questions as ever.
Considering that, I mean, there's just general questions. When engineering just seems to be a particular aspect of realizing that concretely. And would you say that's an accurate description? Like, at least for you professionally? Would you say that's accurate?
Yes. One thing about engineering, the level of engineering that's done in modern times, well, let me put that more in the last 2 centuries, say. The thing is, there's an interesting thing for philosophy there, I think, is that you have the idea of a system which is organized in this teleological way. It has a function. It's performing some work. It could be a manufacturing plant. It could be a rail system, whatever. And it could be a clock. But the thing is, once you've got those in your head, you can't help but look at biological systems a little differently, because you see, oh, that's like an engineered system. And it's got this subdivision is producing this instrumentation is sensing this back to a controller and whatnot. And that's really a wonderful, helpful luck that we have that background now as we look at really thinking big about biological systems. It's nice.
Yeah. Or where do you, when taking that perspective, imagine you were like in ancient Greece, what do you think you would be doing if you were individually? What would you be doing if you didn't know the scientific facts, but still had the same philosophical curiosity?
It could be that I could have qualified to become a geometer and get students with them. The reason I say that is because I was pretty good in geometry in high school, and then later took to it in more advanced levels. So most of my learning is self-learning. And my family had a history of being good at that. I had one who became a professor. Her PhD dissertation was in geometry as a cousin. And the other one, her sister, PhD and taught calculus her whole life. So there is something of a knack there, but maybe you'd get into that, but I think overwhelmingly, of course, realistically, populations are just illiterate, unknown, no trace of them, of course, undermines their existence. So your chances are, if you wanted to think about that sort of thing, is that you would be a manual worker, slave worker, whatever.
Yeah, it seems like, now that you mentioned that, it is fascinating to think that so many people, couldn't read, couldn't write at that time.
Mhm.
Like, what kind of potential would there have been if everybody could read and write? On the other hand, was it like, what was the cause that it could be like? You could say the society, but then you could also say it wasn't scientifically developed enough to get people to be able to learn.
That's true. Yeah. Right. You haven't built up enough capital and structure in terms of machines to make the labor, the human labor, as productive as we are today. We have all this structure of machines that makes one person's work magnify 1,000 times compared to just, well, my grandfather on one side, anyway, well, both sides really, they farmed with mules. This is back in the early 20th century. And that was a decision later on to buy. And it's just gone on and on up from there. I should mention, I do physical work in the afternoons. I work outside. We have an acreage, we have woods, I cut firewood, and so forth. But that's from my childhood background. My folks were both raised on basically self-sufficient farms during the Great Depression, and they became the young people who did World War II.
Mhm.
And those people knew how to do so many things, so many things. And a lot of them I learned, not as much as I want, but we butchered, we went hunting for sport, but even though we didn't live on the farms were still there. We went out there and did those things and learned how to do them. And the world's incredibly changed since then. But there is that side of me. I like people. I like people who know things, but I also like people who know how to do things like that, and who do them. My folks did them. They bought a 2-acre empty plot of land outside of Oklahoma City. They said, this is where we'll build our house. And they built it, 2,700 square feet. They built it, you know, the stonework, the carpentry, everything but the electrical. And I was growing up in that environment while they were doing that. So it's a side of me that's there with with the morning side, which does all the philosophy.
Yeah.
So to speak.
And to me, there seems like there is an intellectual connection between physical work and intellectual work that's strictly by books. I mean, it seems like to actually be aware of, to be good at something physically, yet to be focused and aware and realize how to think about things, even generally to build skills and apply practical knowledge.
Mhm.
In what way do you think you integrate your really complex abstract philosophy with like hands-on working with your hands? I'm trying to think.
Well, it just seems the most natural thing in the world for me, because those, like my parents' generation, when they were children, education was valued. I visited down and talked to an old woman maybe a decade ago. She remembered 4 children on a horse, and they would go to school. That way, she always remembered those children, and they always valued education. They didn't always have a chance to go very far with it. I got to go to more education, had more advantage in that respect than my parents' generation. But because you grew up where that was available to you, both your school and then what you were learning at home of a more practical nature, and I should say too, morals that learned at home. Some from the pastor at a certain age, but at home, the parents are doing all that. And it just seems like the most natural thing in the world, that it is integrated, that it's all one thing. You can make dinner, you can set a nice table if you're having guests. And all of those things just seem to so right, so together for humans.
Yeah, it's weird to say I relate to that. Like I could read something dense by Aristotle that most people I know either don't care or they're just not into that particular subject, but it seems just as natural as cooking a delicious meal. Like I don't really see them as like there's the physical and mental. It's just like one is interesting just as much. They're just as intellectual, both of them to me. Both are in a sense, both just as physical, because if you're reading a book, you gotta focus on the words or even focus on even the world around you just to concretize what you see.
Right.
You have to be both.
Yeah.
In both sense, both.
Yeah.
Mental
I burnt the cookies this afternoon because I got a little distracted with their stuff. But normally I try not to mix the two.
Here. Well, speaking of mixing the two, I do think when any kind of teacher takes a sort of Aristotelian approach where usually begin with first principles in their teaching method, like those are the best teachers, especially with cooking and baking, where they begin with some basic principles and building from there, usually using observation, like smelling the ingredients carefully, feeling them, looking at them and all those things, and really using your senses. It really seems like that's the combination of the really abstract with the hands-on.
Mhm. I like, there's a Maria Montessori, and she's talked about education at different levels, but she was talking about adolescence, when you reach adolescence, and she was talking about value of putting some physical labor, physical skills in there in education. And she said there, this is a written thing, she said, all work is noble. And I thought, that's after my own heart there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always remembered from a college job during college, the first time with my own money that I made right there, and I'd cut off dependence from my parents that I'd grown up with. I had a hamburger, and that was the best tasting hamburger I would ever have in my life because I made the money. I paid for it.
Yeah.
A lot of those values of Ayn Rand concerning independence were in the American culture already. I saw a documentary by Ken Burns on the Dust Bowl, and part of that came into northwestern Oklahoma. And there were people who were, outside helpers would try to come to their house and say, do you need anything? Trying to help them get food. And you could see that the family was starving. And they would just tell you, everything's okay. It's fine. And frankly, I was still of that frame of mind when I came to Chicago. My attitude was you make it or you starve. And you don't ask for help. And I've changed a little bit on that. And of course, the society's become richer since then, actually. But that's pretty deep at least in the older American culture, that independent side of Ayn Rand fit right in. They were the same mind on that aspect, I think.
Yeah.
I guess the biggest change that she was posing to him was, on the surface, was just leaving the religion conflict aside, was just that you should gauge everything by your own self-interest.
Mm-hmm.
The mind of Americans was more mixed on that. I think generally but gotta think about the other guy too. Of course she did, but there was some old and some new in from the fountainhead forward. I think as far as the culture that was receiving it in America, anyway.
Yeah, I found her Big Rand just a natural expression of American philosophy. Just putting into words, like into those philosophical words, but it's important to have somebody to express that. I think it's very helpful.
She's a good polemist too. She really was.
Yeah. Well, thanks for talking to me. I really had a good time talking to you.
Yeah, well, it's delightful to hear you and talk to you. Yeah. finally I can, well, you know, when I go to these meetings of the American Philosophical Association, one fun thing is that somebody whose name you've known a long time, you get to see them read a paper.
Yeah.
And see them interact. And I do keep that. I mean, that's in my head thereafter. I'm always reading the book by them, and I'm always seeing them.
Yeah.
So I'll be seeing you for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. So, yeah. Oh, great talking to you.
Okay.
I'll be in touch.
Okay. So long. Thank you very much.
Thanks.